So one day Jesus was in the temple in Jerusalem, and he was just hanging out. He was doing temple stuff, he was worshiping, he was doing what any Jewish person might do. But the problem is he was Jesus. And so Jesus, it was very hard for him just to go in public and do anything. And it was particularly hard for him to go into the temple and do anything because people recognized him and people wanted to hear what he had to say about things. Some people kind of came armed with questions. Other people, whether they had questions or not, they wanted to listen to what he had to say when he answered other people's questions. So one day Jesus is in the temple. He's just worshiping. He's just hanging out. He's just doing his thing. And he ends up sort of surrounded by a group of people who want to listen to him teach. And so Jesus decides, you know what, let's give the people what they want. And he sits down and he teaches these people who were there, at the temple and they wanted to learn. So everything is going good. Jesus is answering questions. I doubt he had anything prepared, but he's answering questions. He's, kind of riffing on whatever, whatever it is that he's doing. And everything gets interrupted by a commotion by some religious leaders of Israel. The interesting thing about it is usually the religious leaders of Israel don't hang out very often together. As we talked about this summer, the Pharisees and the Sadducees don't like each other. They're sort of rivals politically. They're rivals religiously. They both want power for themselves. They don't usually hang out with each other, but as it turns out, they have a common enemy in Jesus. And so every now and then in the scriptures, you'll read that they get together. And on this particular day, they got together to try to trap Jesus in something. They brought with them, it wasn't just Pharisees and Sadducees, but it was Pharisees and Sadducees, and they had with them kicking and screaming, literally, a woman that they had, and she was crying, and she was upset, and all these things, and the crowd, of course, is trying to figure out what's happening. If right now I was preaching and somebody came kicking and screaming with a woman in here, that would be very distracting for everyone. Jesus' teaching stops. It's all just interrupted. And the religious leaders, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, bring the woman and drop the woman at Jesus' feet and say, "Hey, Jesus, we've got a question for you." They say, "We caught this woman in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses says that she needs to be killed. She needs to be stoned to death. That's what the law of Moses says. Jesus, you're always teaching. What do you say about this woman?" Now, this was, of course, a trick question. This was a trap of a question. This was not something that was really, it was kind of one of those no-win situations for Jesus. Because at the end of the day, he had really two choices. He could say to these Pharisees and these Sadducees, he could say, yeah, let's go ahead and kill her. He could say that. And by doing that, he would be upholding the law of Moses. He would be upholding the scriptures. He would be backing up the Pharisees and the Sadducees and sort of the way they understood the scriptures. But he would really be going against everything else he'd been teaching for however long he'd been teaching it about love and grace and mercy and kindness and all of those things. If you're Jesus and you've sort of made your name on being gracious and kind, kill the adulteress doesn't work out too well. If, on the other hand, he says something to the effect of what I just said, which is, let's not kill the adulteress, well, suddenly now that can be easily construed as Jesus not respecting the law of Moses, which can be easily construed as Jesus not respecting the law at all, the temple, Jewish religion, Moses himself. I mean, once you sort of do that sort of thing, it becomes really easy to kind of twist that into let's attack Jesus. And that's what the whole point of this whole thing was the religious leaders trying to attack Jesus. Because much as Jesus was popular, he goes in the temple and people come out and they have to, they have questions, they want to listen to him teach. Much as Jesus is popular with kind of common everyday people, the religious leaders they can't stand Jesus because Jesus contradicts them. And yeah, that's annoying. But there's more to it than just Jesus disagrees. You see, the religious leaders of Israel, they have power because Rome gave them power. That's why they have power. And Rome gave them power because Rome sees that they have the people on their side. If the people are no longer on the side of the Sadducees or the Pharisees or any religious Jewish leader, then Rome has no reason to allow them to stay in power. So if Jesus is going to undercut their authority, if Jesus is going to contradict them, argue with them, get the people to not like them, what that really does is take power away from the religious leaders. Rome could give it to anyone else, and that's really where it was. So this was a game about power. And so the religious leaders, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, they put Jesus in this no-win situation where no matter what he says, he's going to be wrong. No matter what he says, he's going to make people angry. And oh, by the way, this is about like the most hot-button issue in the world. Like from the dawn of humanity up until today, sexual stuff is always really controversial. It's always really scandalous. Like we freak out about that way more than we freak out about other sinful things or other harmful things. And this woman caught in adultery, she's not just blowing up her family, she's blowing up somebody else's family. There's multiple, victims here. Everybody would have looked at this woman and been really angry with her no matter what, right? So it's just a whole mess of a situation. And so Jesus, put into a no-win situation, does what I think we should all do when we're put into a no-win situation, and that is nothing. Jesus does absolutely nothing. He bends down into like the dust, the dirt of the ground at the temple there, and he just starts writing something. We would know what he wrote probably, except as we've been discussing for the last 6 weeks, nobody could read, so they couldn't actually tell what he was writing. But he was writing something, and he's really just blowing the religious leaders off. He's just, I'm just not going to deal with this question. And so the religious leaders give him a minute, and they're like, hey, we asked you a question, and Jesus continues to ignore them, and say, hey, we asked you a question, and Jesus continues to ignore them, and they keep pushing for an answer. And Jesus really, it's like he's totally disinterested in all of it. And finally, when they keep pushing, Jesus gives them an answer. He says, okay, great, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stone her. The law says so, after all. But the only way this is going to be just and fair is if the person who starts the proceedings is without sin. So whoever is not sinned, you throw the first stone, we'll all follow you, and we're going to have a good old-fashioned execution right here. And then Jesus went back to writing in the dirt, something that no one could read. Of course, that shifts the whole thing. That shifts the whole situation back to the religious leaders. It's sort of genius. What I love about this is, number one, Jesus gives an interpretation of the law of Moses that is absolutely honoring to the text, is respectful to the text, but is also gracious and kind. Capital punishment, in Jesus' opinion, is wonderful. It's a great thing, so long as the person carrying out the capital punishment is righteous. You want to have capital punishment? Have at it. Just make sure you're righteous yourself. So he gives the explanation that he wants. I mean, great, have at it, let's do that. Honors the law of Moses, allows the people to have their pound of flesh if anyone here is righteous, but also knows full well that everything going on here is a game, and no one is going to stand here with a straight face in front of Jesus, or much more importantly, in front of the crowd of people that Jesus was teaching, and say, oh, I'm sinless, let me throw the first stone. Jesus knows he's showing the people exactly who the religious leaders are, and he knows this woman is safe because he knows how terrible these people are, and he knows that they're not about to claim they're sinless in front of this whole crowd. So one by one, starting with the oldest, the religious leaders just kind of leave, kind of slink out, sheepishly. And when all is said and done, it's just Jesus and this crowd of people and the woman. Everybody else, all the people that were, brought her in, they've all left. And Jesus looked at the woman and he said, hey, where'd all of your accusers go? Like, is anybody, are they all gone? And I always think Jesus being, he's just being funny. Like, hey, where'd all those guys go? Like, he knows where they went, but he's asking. And he says, is there anyone here who's going to accuse you? And the woman's like, no, they all seem to be gone. And Jesus says, great, well then, I'm not about to condemn you either. So just go and sin no more. And that's a story I didn't need to tell. Listen, I get it. I like that story. I would say that I love that story in the way that you love stories. I love that story. It's a great story, okay? But I promise you that every person in this room, I could have just said, woman caught in adultery, and you'd be like, yeah, I know that story. I promise you, you can admit it to yourself. You don't say it out loud, but there was a moment or two as I was telling that like you started thinking about other stuff? You started thinking about lunch, or your fantasy football lineup, or something else? Because like you've heard that story, like, okay, like I know when we get to the go and sin no more, then I can get back to the point. Because like that story. It's a really famous story. In fact, this is probably, I asked Stephanie this week, we were talking about it, and Stephanie actually said she thinks this is the most famous story of Jesus. This is the one people always talk about. At least people quote it, whether they know it's a story of Jesus or not. People, that whole, cast the first stone, that phrasing, that's something that's really common in our world. If you were to ask people kind of who Jesus is, this is a story that really comes to the forefront. It's a really important and fundamental and foundational story for Jesus. In fact, I think if I were to try to explain who Jesus is in one story, that this is as good as you can get. And the reason is it just shows all the stuff, right? So like in this story, we see Jesus popular with common people, but, disliked by religious leaders. So we have that dichotomy between Jesus is very obviously speaking for God. He's very obviously, a prophetic teacher, but also like other religious leaders just despise him. And so there's all of that tension going on. And then we see Jesus interpreting the law totally differently. I mean, this idea of looking at the law, looking at something about capital punishment and coming up with, yes, capital punishment is good and just when the person doing it is righteous, right? Like, I don't know anybody who ever came up with that. That's seemingly a brand new thought from Jesus. Maybe somebody else, but as far as we know, that's a brand new thought from Jesus. Jesus is completely unique. He honors the scriptures, but he changes the scriptures. He twists them. He molds them. He shapes them into something holy and set apart and loving and kind, right? Because that's who Jesus is at the end of the day. This is a story that no religious Jewish leader in the world would have treated this woman with the kindness Jesus did, right? Like there's absolutely like to just say I'm not going to condemn you, to stand up for her in front of this crowd. To the only thing he says that's close to a rebuke is go and sin no more, which is. If you guys are parents and like your kid gets into trouble and all you say is like, yeah, just don't do it again. Like you are aware that's not really punishing your kids. Like it's not doing anything. Like this is scandalous, right? But all of these elements are in this one story, and so we can see who Jesus is as the Son of God, understanding the scriptures differently, teaching differently, showing compassion and understanding and love and grace. I mean, if I were just to introduce somebody to Jesus and I could only use one story in the Bible, I think this would be it. And that's an interesting thing for me to say. That's an interesting thing. Because when the Bible was written, that story wasn't in it. If you look in your Bible, every Bible I've ever seen has a footnote right here. There's a footnote. And the footnote says, and it's one of these things, the footnote says, the most ancient manuscripts do not contain this story. And they're telling you the truth. But to understand what we're talking about, we should make sure that we understand what we're talking about here. So for simplicity's sake, it's not quite so neat, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say this. The New Testament, what we have in our Bibles, the 27 books in our Bible, in the New Testament, those are all written, we'll call it by the end of 100 AD. By 100 AD, the 27 books of our Bible exist. They have been written. They are beginning to be passed around. As we've been discussing for 6 weeks, virtually nobody can read them, but in every community there's going to be somebody. So Paul would write a letter and then one or two people in the church can read it, so they read it out loud to everybody and they talk about it. Or, the Gospels or whatever, like the book of Luke, for example, is written to a guy who could read. That's more of like a personal thing. All these different ideas, all these different things. But within the first, 70 years or so after Jesus dies, the New Testament is written, okay? And so we as Christians now, or as even just, historians now, we are looking back and we are always trying to find the earliest manuscript, meaning the earliest copy of the Bible that we can find, as close to 100 AD or so as possible. Like there's some stuff with Paul, like we could get back into the 50s or 60s, but we've never found that stuff all the way far back. But what we have is stuff that's really, really, really old. here's what we have with this story with the woman caught in adultery, which in your Bible is in John chapter 8. Okay? That is, as far as we can tell, was not in the book of John in 100 AD. John did not write this story down. We know that because by about 200 AD, which we have all these copies, it's certainly not there in 200 AD. It's not there in 250 AD. It's not there in 300 AD. It's not there in 350 AD. By the very end of the 4th century, 380, 390, almost 400 AD, we start finding manuscripts where this story of the woman caught in adultery is in the Bible. But at first, we actually don't find it in John. We find it in Luke, which is odd, because Luke is not John. It's odd. Eventually, right around the real late 4th century, real early 5th century, suddenly, all at once, it's like the church, the world, somebody decided, oh, it should be in John chapter 8. And from the 400s on, it's in the Bible where we have it. Now that's interesting. It's really interesting. So you might be asking, well, what's going on? Like, we're just adding to the Bible now. Huh? That seems like an alarming thing. Well, this is what happened, okay? Few things from history that we know. We have in antiquity, in the ancient world, we have a lot more than just the Bible that's been written. We have a lot of other writings, a lot of other Christians, a lot of other people. And what we find is between 150, 200 or so, and the 400s, we have 5 different people reference or tell this story in their writings, which tells us this. People knew this story before it was in the Bible. For 300 years, this story was out there floating around. Sometimes it was written down, but mainly it was just floating around with people talking about it, which, by the way, we're sort of getting to the whole point of what we've been talking about for the last 6 weeks. Ancient people couldn't read. It makes no difference if this story is in the book of John in 150 to 95% of people, because they can't read the book of John anyway. What makes a difference is if somebody tells them the story. What makes a difference is if they share the story. What makes a difference is if they, as person to person, family to family, community to community, share this story. And this story is, interestingly enough, this is really the only time that we can tell this happened in. Okay, it's really obvious this story is not original to John. We're gonna get there in a minute. It's really, really obvious. But it's the only time that we can tell for sure, at least, that somebody decided we're going to add this thing later. What we can tell by the best of our ability is for 300 years or so, the church sat down over and over and over and over and over and told this story as part of the gospel, as part of the story of Jesus. That it didn't get written down by the original gospel writers is irrelevant to the fact that people who couldn't read were telling this story along with everything else. And around the time that the Catholic Church is becoming the Catholic Church, around the time that the Bible is becoming assembled in the form that we understand it, around the time that all of these things are happening, people sit down and are saying, hey, we should put that story in, because everybody tells that story anyway. And everybody, that is part of this whole thing. And then when they said, okay, well, where do we put it? The first instinct was Luke. They didn't like it there. And so then they ended up putting it in John. Which is all incredibly interesting. One more random thing. There's a guy named Augustine. Augustine is at the core of founding the Catholic Church. And I disagree with a lot of things with Augustine's, and I also disagree with this. But Augustine says that actually this story was original somewhere in the Bible, but that people were so offended by Jesus being kind to this woman that they actually censored the story and just took it out. And that what they were doing in the 4th and 5th century was putting it back in after it had been taken out. Now look, I don't think that's true. There's not even a shred of evidence that happened other than one guy said it once. But let's say it is true for a second. Let's say I'm wrong and that's what happened. The power of this story is it survived hundreds of years of censorship and made it out on the other side and got written down. This story is so powerful. It didn't need to be written by an apostle to become part of Scripture. It didn't need to be written at all to be part of who we are as a church. And I think that's incredible. But I do have a question. Why John chapter 8? Like, they could have put it anywhere. We have no idea where this story is chronologically in Jesus' ministry. Like, I know it's not early in his ministry because people already know him and the Pharisees and all of that. I know that. I know we can sort of date it somewhere because Jesus was in Jerusalem, which means, if he's somewhere else, we know that, like, okay, well, it's not that. But we have, there's a lot of options as to where this is. Why John chapter 8? And now's when I tell you that here's one of the reasons we know it's really obvious what's happening. John chapter 7 and John chapter 8 are a story. They're like one episode, right? And this story of the woman caught in adultery is stuck right in the middle of the story. It's like they tell this event, say, hit pause, tell the woman caught in adultery, unpause, and finish the story. It is incredibly obvious. They weren't trying to hide this. In fact, they were trying to draw your attention by interrupting the story with the story of the woman caught in adultery. So I have a question. It's real simple. Why? Why that story? Why John chapter 8? To answer that, well, let's talk about John chapter 7 and 8. So it was a feast. A festival. The Jews have lots of holidays, and this holiday in particular was called the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles at this time, and at all times, the Feast of Tabernacles in the Jewish religion celebrates God's provision during a really difficult time. After the Exodus, when they were traveling in the wilderness, and they were homeless for 40 years, I don't know that we think about it that often that way, but they were homeless. They had no home. For 40 years of being homeless, the Feast of Tabernacles celebrates that while they were homeless, while they were traveling, while they were nomads, that God's provision was there for them. So the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles is a celebration of freedom and salvation, of God in the Exodus redeeming them, and then when life was really, really hard, and when they didn't have any place to go, and they had nowhere to lay their heads, God still loved them and cared for them and provided for them. That is the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a week-long celebration of God, of their nation's history, really sort of similar to like the 4th of July, but for a week, right? So that's sort of the way that things go. So Jesus wants to go to the feast because Jesus is Jewish. We started this out by saying Jesus just wanted to go to the temple. Jesus just wants to go to Jerusalem and just wants to be Jewish, right? He just wants to celebrate because that's who he is. But the problem is, at this point in his ministry, Jesus, he's just too famous for that. And not all of the fame is good. For a long time during Jesus' ministry, really from day one, the religious leaders don't like Jesus. But there's a difference between not liking Jesus, it being tense and hostile, and wanting to kill Jesus. And right around the time of this particular Feast of the Tabernacles, they started wanting to kill Jesus. And so they thought he was coming, so the religious leaders sent the temple guard out into the festival to try to arrest Jesus. And Jesus knows this. Like, he knows they want to kill me. If I go and teach, I'm going to get arrested. And Jesus knows, Jesus is well aware that he's going to die, but he's also well aware that it's not really time for that yet. And so Jesus, he doesn't want to go to the temple, but I love this idea. I love part of what I love this story is it's so, sometimes we wonder like how human is Jesus? And I just love the humanity of Jesus here. Jesus knows it's a terrible idea to go to this festival, but man, does he want to go to the festival. And so he decides, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the festival, but I'm not going to teach anything. I'm just going to blend in. I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm just going to be quiet, and it's going to be great. Like that was ever going to work, right? Jesus knows it's a bad idea. He goes anyway, and he goes, and it's a week-long festival for like 3 days or so. Everything's fine, except he keeps hearing people talk about him, and he can see the people wanting to arrest him, and like everywhere he goes, he is the topic of conversation, and he's like, man, I just really want to say some stuff. And so halfway through this festival, Jesus, who had convinced himself he could go and blend in, now he's not blending in. And so he goes, and on the middle of the festival, Jesus decides to teach and do what he always does. And of course, the crowds come. And of course, I mean, it's just this huge thing. And so there's some people that think Jesus is just nuts and, dangerous and revolutionary and stuff. But most people believe in Jesus. Like, most people think that he's great and think that, what he's saying is wonderful and it's unlike anything they've ever heard before. And that's awesome. And so Jesus teaches, and it's going great. And then we learn this. One of the funnier verses in the Bible that's also one of the sadder. John chapter 7, this is what we read happened at the end of that day. It says, when the temple guards returned without having arrested Jesus, the leading priests and Pharisees demanded, why didn't you bring him in? We have never heard anyone speak like this, the guards responded. Have you been led astray too? The Pharisees mocked. Is there a single one of us rulers or Pharisees who believes in him? This foolish crowd follows him, but they are ignorant of the law, and God's curse is on them. Let's get the funny stuff out of the way for a second. The temple guard are the police, right? They're the local authority. They have been sent to arrest Jesus. They have one job: go get Jesus. For 3 days, they can't find Jesus. Then Jesus starts teaching, and the temple guard now found Jesus. And they're like, oh, well, we'll get him after he's done talking. And Jesus is so convincing that they decide, well, we can't arrest this guy. He's awesome. He's just great. And they go back to the Pharisees, and it's like, guys, have you heard him? Like, I know you want him arrested, but like, you're into theology. Maybe you should just listen. Like, he's great. Jesus is amazing. I just think it's so funny that the guys sent to arrest Jesus fall in love with Jesus. It's really funny. But then we see something fascinating. The rebuke from the religious leaders. And if we can pay attention to this really carefully, we see something kind of awful. Okay? The religious leaders are talking to the temple guard, and they're like, hey, have you been led astray? Also, have you been led astray too? They said, none of us believe in Jesus. The crowd follows him, but they're foolish and ignorant. So they say the crowds of people who are following Jesus are foolish, meaning they're dumb, but also they're ignorant, meaning they're ill-informed. Now, we should understand, neither one of those two things are anybody's fault. If you're a dumb person, that's not your fault. Like, you can't help being dumb. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just like, if you're an unintelligent person, that is not something you chose to be. Furthermore, if you're ill-informed, if you're ignorant, that is, again, also not your fault. Imagine trying to get information in the first century in Roman-occupied Israel. Like, information is hard to come by back then. Being ignorant, again, was not their fault. They were trying. It says they're ignorant of the law. Guess what? 95% of them can't read. That's why they're ignorant of the law. They can't read it. But finally, they said, you've been led astray. By definition, being led astray is not your fault. Going astray, that's your fault. Being led astray, not your fault. Did I say that right? Okay, good. In my head, it was weird. Okay. The point is this. The religious leaders of Israel were saying it's not the crowds of people's fault that they are wrong. They believe in Jesus and are wrong, but they've been led astray, they're dumb, and they're ignorant. None of those things are their fault. And yet, God's curse is upon them. Which is a fancy way of saying this. The religious leaders believed that people who were wrong through no fault of their own were cursed by God. Which is another way of saying the religious leaders' view of God was that God is graceless, God is compassionless, God does not understand what it's like to be a fallible human. Their understanding of God was a God who was just looking for a reason to curse somebody. That's the God they teach. A God who curses when you make a mistake through no fault of your own. So we're not done. So the next day, Jesus is out teaching. He's out teaching. That's this part before the woman caught in adultery. After the woman caught in adultery, Jesus goes back and teaches. And this time, he talks a little bit to the religious leaders, but for the most part, now he's talking to people who believe in him. And that's really, really important. Jesus talks to people who believe in him. People who think, at the very least, that he's a prophet. People who think, at the very least, he's a good teacher. Some of whom absolutely believe that he is the Messiah at this point, right? And these people are listening to him, and the day before they liked him. And they woke up that morning and they liked him, right? And so they go out and they listen to Jesus teach, and Jesus says something to them that absolutely offends them. He says, "The truth will set you free," he says. And you got to remember, this is like the 4th of July for a week. Imagine if on the 4th of July I say, "Hey, America will be set free one day." I mean, that, like, the whole thing we're celebrating is that we are free, right? They thought they were already free. They thought they were already saved. Jesus, by saying, I will set you free, is saying you need to be set free, you need to be saved. Jesus was telling them they're not that yet. And the people got real mad. Just super mad. And they went back and forth, and there was an argument, and things got bad, and some people got called the sons of the devil, and it just got out of hand. And at the end of it, they said, "Well, we're sons of Abraham. You're not better than Abraham." And then this is what Jesus says in John chapter 8. We read this. Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth. Before Abraham was even born, I am." And at that point, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden from them and left the temple. That "I am" language is the language that God uses. Jesus is saying, "I'm God." And the people that believed in Jesus, like 10 minutes before, decided they needed to kill him. Which somewhat makes sense, to the degree that it makes sense that, it is a capital crime to claim that you're God in the Jewish religion. But it's also fascinating that they believed that they had enough information to, after like a 10-minute conversation, to kill the guy they had previously believed in. They believed that they themselves were able to do that they had the authority by God to do that. They believed that they could judge Jesus rightly enough to execute him right then and there. And I don't know if I need to finish the sermon or else if you've got it. But it makes a whole lot of sense why this story, this event in Jesus' life, why somebody said, "You know what, that's a real good place for the woman caught in adultery story to be stuck in the middle of." Because on the one hand, you have the religious leaders saying, "We believe that God curses people who accidentally get things wrong by mistake. They're led astray. It's not their fault. They're idiots. They're foolish. They're ignorant. None of that's their fault, but God curses them anyway." And the story of the woman caught in adultery, you know what Jesus does? He looks at a woman who was purposely sinning. She purposely got in bed with another man. She did that on purpose. She wasn't trying to do what God wanted. She was trying to sleep with another woman's husband. And Jesus showed her compassion. They said, "God curses those who try and fail." Jesus says, "I will bless someone who didn't even try in the first place." And then we have an incident where these people are trying to stone Jesus. They believed in Jesus, right? 15 minutes before they believed in Jesus, Jesus says one wrong thing in their estimation. It wasn't wrong, he is God. But Jesus says one wrong thing in their estimation, and suddenly they're going to murder him. They're going to stone him. Jesus didn't deserve that, by the way. Jesus is the one sinless guy in any room. And so in the story of the woman caught in adultery, Jesus, the one sinless guy in the room, the one guy who can carry out this capital sentence of death, he tells her, "Well, I never would do that." He tells the woman who, again, deserves it, "I never do that." At the end of the day, what we see about Jesus is how different he is. And guys, at the end of the day, I see so much of us in this story. I see so many people who believe in a God who curses people, who punishes people, who just looking for a reason to just, bring fire from heaven. We have this fear of God that, well, if I make any mistake, God's just coming after me. If those people make a mistake, he's coming after them. We still have that view of God. And quite frankly, we still have that view of ourselves, that we are in a position to judge somebody else, that we are in a position to condemn somebody else, that I'm good enough to be able to, I've got life figured out. I can say what's up with that guy over there. I can judge that lady over there. The woman caught in adultery in this story, it is the antidote to all of that. Jesus shows us a God who is so much more kind, so much more human and understanding. That's what the incarnation is all about, is God understanding who we are. And a God who says, yeah, look, I have every right to do this. I have every right to stone you to death, but I'm not going to. I think John chapter 8 is a great place for the story of Jesus. And I think this story of the woman caught in adultery, it's one of my favorite stories. I don't know that I care one way or the other who wrote it down first. That's who Jesus is. That's what our faith is. That's the foundation of who we are as people. And I'm grateful that our forefathers in the 4th century said, you know what? This has been floating around for 300 years, around people who couldn't read. Let's write it down for those who can. And this morning, we're in our 6th week of our series called Divine Words for the Illiterate. And as we talk about the woman caught in adultery, we talk about the way the Pharisees saw a cruel, ungraceful God, a graceless God, as we understand that we are not in a position to judge and show anything to anyone else. We learn a beautiful, beautiful lesson that we just need to take with us in all of our endeavors. Our 6th lesson from the illiterate is this: the mercy and compassion of Jesus can never be overstated. The mercy and compassion of Jesus can never be overstated. We're going to sing a song. The musicians are going to come forward. We're going to sing that song we sang earlier. We offer an invitation each and every week to take Christ up on this mercy, this beautiful gift of grace, to embrace who he is, to embrace who we can be, and to become people of mercy and kindness and love. The Bible teaches that we are to repent and be baptized. It sounds like 2 things. I promise you it's just one. In repentance, we change our minds. We say, look, I understand I'm not in a position to stone anybody. I understand I am not that righteous person who can make these judgments. But I am going to trust in the goodness of a God whose mercy cannot be overstated, a goodness of a God who does not curse because we make mistakes, but instead who shows us mercy and love and grace in every one of our endeavors. In baptism, there's a picture of that. We align ourselves with Christ's death and resurrection. We've never made a decision. We got a nice warm baptistry. Let's talk. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up what we do it. And we want to emulate Christ, the Christ who did not throw that stone, the Christ who did show mercy, the Christ who did interpret the scriptures in a way that was kind, and the Christ who lived a life of love for others. As we stand,